So this is a very special event for us because it does honor Jonathan Mann's memory and a theme that's very integral to the identity of the school, which is the importance of social justice to health and health as a human right. And so we're going to start off by hearing a few words about Jonathan Mann from Dr. Walter Cohen. Dr. Cohen is Chancellor Emeritus of Drexel University College of Medicine, and we are very fortunate to have him as a member of our Dean's Advisory Council, and he has very generously supported this lecture. I'll just tell you a few things about Dr. Cohen. He's from Philadelphia. He attended University of Pennsylvania and graduated from dental medicine in 1950, and then served on the faculty for many years as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and then Dean. And in 1986, he became president of the Medical College of Pennsylvania, where he opened a new educational campus at Queen Lane. In 1993, he became chancellor of the Medical College of Pennsylvania, and he led a very successful administration, greatly expanding many faculty and the size of the college. And he also was a co-founder of the ELAM program, which is a program for leadership, women and leadership in academic medicine, very important program. And in 1998, he was among the academic leaders who welcomed Dr. Mann as Dean of the new School of Public Health here at Drexel, today known as the Dornsife School of Public Health. And so we're very happy to have him join us to say a few words about Jonathan Mann.
Thank you, Anna. The entire scientific world was shocked on September 2nd, 1998, when a Swissair jetliner headed for Geneva crashed off the coast of Canada. Among the passengers on board were Jonathan Mann and his wife, both highly respected and renowned researchers who were headed to a United Nations AIDS vaccine conference. Jonathan Mann had held many high-level positions at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention before establishing the World Health Organization's global program on AIDS, which he ran from 1986 to 1990. Jonathan Mann was born in Boston in 1947. He was the second of 4 children born to Dr. James Mann and Ida Mann. His father was a well-known psychoanalyst who had received his medical degree from Washington University Medical School. His mother was trained as a social worker and for many years worked in that profession. She later pursued interest in visual arts and graduated from the Museum of Fine Arts School at the age of 80. Jonathan followed his sister Carol by going to Harvard. Being a very determined young man, he ran in the Boston Marathon. Jonathan received his BA from Harvard in 1968, and he married Marie Paula Bondat, whom he had met studying political science in Paris during his 3rd year. They had 3 children, twins Naomi and Lydia and Aaron. Lydia we got to know as she attended several previous Jonathan Mann lectures here at Drexel. In 1974, Mann received a medical degree from the Washington University School of Medicine. He had entered medical school with the intention of becoming an ophthalmologist. However, he soon became interested in public health, and after graduating, he and Marie Paula went to New Mexico, where he worked as an epidemiologist for the Center of Disease Control and Prevention. He and Marie Paula shared many interests that they were able to pursue while in New Mexico. He later moved to the state's Department of Public Health, where he stayed for 10 years and was credited with helping to control the bubonic plague. Mann headed the World Health Organization's AIDS program until 1990. During his tenure, tremendous strides were made in the war against AIDS. Daniel Terratono, who joined the endeavor at the beginning recalled later, and I quote, "The program was Mann, a secretary, and one typewriter," end quote. 2 years later, Mann had managed to build a budget of almost $100 million. One of the first initiatives was the establishment of the Global Commission on AIDS, composed of a mix of epidemiologists, scientists, and ethicists. It included June Osborne, then professor of public health at Michigan, and she was one of Mann's closest friends. Richard Rector, a person living with HIV/AIDS, and Mann insisted on his presence on the commission, and a so-called token lawyer, the Honorable Justice Michael Kirby, Justice of the High Court of Australia. Kirby later commented that he would never forget the energy with which Jonathan Mann threw himself into the struggle, surely beyond the capacities of any single human being, or his remarkable mixture of cold logic and passionate call to arms, or his clinical mobilization of hard-won epidemiological experience leavened by demands for respect for human rights, which seemed to resonate deeply within him and to take equal strength from his American and his Jewish identification, or his brilliant skill in answering tricky questions alternatively in English and French, paying courtesy to the interlocutors in each of the principal languages of the United Nations. It is a dazzling display of high intelligence, skilled professionalism, and absolute dedication. Mann's determination to respect each individual, his dogged moral conviction that effectively countered many governments' denials of the existence of AIDS among their people, and his denouncement of inhumane policies inflicted upon people with HIV. In 1995, Mann met Mary Lou Clements, a highly respected researcher in her own right, while working on an expert committee that was developing new strategies to fight disease, and they were married in 1996. In 1998, as you heard, Dr. Mann was appointed dean of the school, which was unfortunately a short-lived experience. I had the privilege of getting to know him and Mary Lou. He was a warm, bright, compassionate academician with great plans for the school, which he never had the chance to implement. One connection that still remains, he designed the pin that is given to new students here each year. He'll be remembered as a champion for human rights in the fight against AIDS. And I want to thank Dean Emerita Marla Gold for helping me with these comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walter. I have to say, when I first started here, someone sent me some papers by Jonathan Mann. I can't remember who it was. Was it Kevin? I don't know. Yeah, it was Kevin. And I remember being struck. I had not read any of his work, but I remember being struck by how what he was writing was so aligned with the whole social determinants of health framework, which has become so popular now. So it was really striking to me to read that. And some of these papers had been written a number of years ago. So it's my pleasure today to introduce to you our speaker, Deborah Prothrow-Stith. Dr. Prothrow-Stith is Dean and Professor of Medicine at the College of Medicine, Charles Drew University of Medicine and Science, and she is an internationally recognized public health leader in a number of areas. Before becoming Dean, she was with the global executive search consulting firm Spencer Stuart and advised many top-tier healthcare, life sciences, and academic and nonprofit institutions on leadership issues. Before that, she was with the Harvard School of Public Health, where she was the Walcott Professor of Public Health Practice and Associate Dean for Diversity at the school, and she created and led the Division of Public Health Practice and built up substantial funding for that division as well. She's internationally known for her efforts to reduce youth violence, and most importantly, to define youth violence as a public health problem. Has really been a pioneer in this way of thinking about violence. She developed and wrote, among many other things related to this theme, the Violence Prevention Curriculum for Adolescents. She's the author of Deadly Consequences, which is the first book that really presented a public health perspective on violence to a mass audience. It's such a timely book even now. In 1987, Governor Michael Dukakis appointed her the first woman commissioner for public health for Massachusetts, where she led a department of 3,500 employees, 8 hospitals, and a budget of nearly $400 million. And she established the nation's first Office of Violence Prevention in the State Department of Public Health and expanded many prevention programs, including drug treatment programs and rehabilitation programs. In addition to her domestic work, she spent time in Tanzania, where she was involved with a number of academic and nonprofit groups and issues related to HIV treatment and prevention. She graduated from Spelman College and from Harvard Medical School, and she completed her residency at the Boston City Hospital in internal medicine. She's an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, has received no less than 10 honorary degrees, so quite impressive. And she's received many very well-deserved awards. And so I think you can sense from what I've told you that she's really a perfect speaker for this lecture, because she really exemplifies the values of Jonathan Mann and the values that we hope to continue to move forward in our school. So thank you so much for joining us, Deborah.
Good afternoon. I am truly honored to be here, not only because your dean is someone I have tremendous respect for and really appreciate the contributions you've made in the public health community around social justice, and also just because I knew Jonathan Mann as a colleague at the Harvard School of Public Health. So this is truly an honor. And the presentation that was made about him was beautifully done, so I will only add this quote that I love of his, which is that people say there's no use trying to change the world, but if we don't try, will it change? And I think given the political climate of today and the obstacles that we're up against, that's extremely important. I will share that once I was on a panel with Jonathan, and I made some bold statement about, kind of an out-of-the-box statement about what we could do as a society but won't do, and couldn't really do it, but it would really help the problem. Borderline radical statement, and then Jonathan stood up and said, well, I don't know why we can't do it. And I thought, wow, this man has more of a social justice mission in him than I do. I've got to get up to speed, but truly a colleague that you honor appropriately by this lecture. I do want to share some thinking on this problem of violence prevention and our efforts to have it take hold and take it to scale over the last 30 or so years. The Surgeon General's first conference on looking at violence as a public health problem was in 1985 under Surgeon General Koop. And from what we can tell, it was probably one of the first formal efforts within public health to acknowledge this problem. And over those years, a lot has happened, and it's worth kind of looking back, doing a bit of retrospective. But I want to start with one of the lessons that I have learned over and over again in the work, and it comes from a classroom activity very early on in my efforts to contribute. I was working in a 10th grade classroom, the health class at Jeremiah Burke High School in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And one of the things we did in the class was list what makes you angry. And then the next exercise was to list what you could do about it. And one day, a student said that his friend had been stabbed over the weekend and that his friend died and that it took the ambulance 20 minutes to get there, and he was very angry. He lived in Roxbury, which is the neighborhood of Boston, now Boston Medical Center, then Boston City Hospital, where the ambulances are dispatched for the city. And interestingly, the Boston Globe had done an expose on 911 calls, which documented that Roxbury had the longest wait time for 911 calls of any of the neighborhood or surrounding communities in the Boston area. So he really was putting something quite complicated on the table. And when we got to what you can do about it, we struggled. We put up healthy and non-healthy or unhealthy responses. So beat up the ambulance driver was one of the things up there, and we talked about the impact that would have on 911 calls. We talked about, taking it out on someone else, younger brother, sister. We talked about doing nothing, which is probably the most common response to that kind of situation. And that's pretty unhealthy, actually. I think it contributes to carrying around a lot of junk, free-floating anger, as one psychologist called it. But so we then said, okay, let's get to some healthy things. So we talked about writing the mayor a letter, which, is a nice thing to do, and you can get out a lot of anger. You probably can't send the first draft of the letter, but by the third or fourth draft, you might have a cathartic effect. And if the mayor writes you back, then, there's a little bit of a boost there. We then talked about talking to someone about it. And if that's someone who can help you understand kind of society's junk versus what you should internalize, that can be helpful. I mean, parents do that all the time. That's, kind of how we all deal with some of the unfair and ugly things that happen. But that still didn't seem to sort of capture the level of anger. And finally, we came upon what I think is probably, after all these years, still the best response that we had, which is that he would get so angry that he decides to finish high school and become an ambulance driver and plan on taking over the dispatching system for the ambulances. And again, that's kind of what we all try to teach our kids or do with our anger. That really is, let's turn it into action and make it productive. And if we want him to do that, then he's got to have a high school that's going to teach him something so he can pass the test and graduate. And then he's going to have a paramedic training program that's going to let him in and teach him to pass that certification. Then he's going to have a city that's going to hire him as an ambulance driver. And then the city's going to have to promote him. So if we really want him to do that, then we've got a big job ahead of us. And it takes all of us, and it's not simple, but it's not that we don't know what to do. It's just figuring out how to do it consistently and at the scale that affects a large number of people. So that's one of my first my first lessons in this, that a violence prevention curriculum in the classroom is not enough. But it is a good way of learning some very important things, and it is part of the solution. Back in '85, there were those of us, I met Mark Rosenberg at CDC around 1983, and he was really putting the Surgeon General's Conference together. I met Larry Cohen. I understand he was just here at Contra Costa County then in California, who was doing some public active work. I met Howard Spivak, a pediatrician very interested in these issues and a co-author with me on a lot of work over the years, and literally across the country met a few people who started raising the same question that I was raising, which is, why are we stitching people up and sending them out? Why am I interested in serving urban adolescents and graduating from medical school with no competency in the leading cause of death for a population I wanted to serve? Why are we not addressing this issue of violence as a health problem? And with Mark Rosenberg and others, we were starting to make the case. And the magnitude of the problem was one of the big issues that we put on the table. The characteristics of the problem, meaning a lot of the violence, homicides, assaults, rape, a lot occurs in the context of people who know each other, not that stranger bad guy who comes from somewhere else and hurts innocent people. And that's what our public policy addresses more often than not. So we thought, okay, public health needs to get in the fray here. Contact with health professionals, that's how I really started thinking about this after a young man told me, after stitching him up, not to go to bed because he was going to send the guy who cut him in the emergency room, and I was going to get all the practice I needed putting in stitches. And over the years, we learned that whether it's obstetrician gynecologists or oral surgeons or nurse practitioners or visiting nurses, we all have pretty significant contact with both victims and perpetrators of violence. And then lastly, and this, we were making an assumption at that time, that the same strategies that we had used for drunk driving or teenage pregnancy reduction or smoking reduction would help us with this problem. And I think what we've learned over the years is, in fact, that is the case. We have some robust literature on classroom education and school-based programs. We have a pretty robust literature on big brother, big sister mentoring type programs. And I think over time we've figured out that it does matter what we put in front of our children and what we say to them. So we were making the case, and as I said, one of the things we really talked about was the magnitude of the problem. And I show this just to show, we're in that blue line at the top, that even when, because the rates go up and down, but even when we are down, we are not down where other countries are. And I think that's really worth our appreciating, that what we would call our lowest or reduced rates is still a pretty endemic problem when we look at peer countries and compare ourselves to other countries. And of course, guns of the public health literature really stand out as part of our problem. And this is looking at the mechanism by region. And you get a sense that of this global 41% down at the right lower row, our 66% by guns plays a major role in that. And there's some startling numbers, something like 75% of the children who are murdered in the world with a gun are murdered in the United States. That kind of thing is pretty startling to learn. So that's certainly a part of our problem. But one of the things that I've come to appreciate is that we've got another aspect of the problem that really hasn't been on the public health agenda. So this is kind of a second lesson learned, if you will. So the uniform crime reports are regular annual actual data numbers on homicide and other crimes to the National Institute of Justice. And I remember when we were using the uniform crime reports to look at homicide data and understand the characteristics and the rates by race and gender, that there was always this line at the bottom of it didn't go up and down like the rest of the rates, and it was called this thing of justifiable homicide. And you know, it was always about 300 or 400 a year. It never really changed very much. And while puzzled by it enough to look up the definition, I didn't pay much attention to it, because if you read the definition, I mean, it's all about these bad guys, these felons, and they're getting killed as part of the felony. And so I'm not going to use public health strategies to address that. So I never paid much attention to it. But thank God for cameras, because this world that we are in now makes it very clear that all of those felons were actually probably not felons. And in fact, when we think about, you know, a guy on the sidewalk, you know, maybe selling illegal cigarettes, who winds up dead, all of a sudden it puts this justifiable homicide question right smack in the middle of the public health agenda. So it becomes, I think, important for us to think about the role of the police, because they are important partners as we think about violence prevention. But in order to really have an authentic partnership and an authentic approach to a community, the history is important, and that part of policing that dates all the way back to recapturing slaves is also important. You might have seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, but this is an 1851 poster out of Boston that is a warning to the colored people of Boston, letting them know that an ordinance had been recently passed that by the mayor and the alderman, that the police officers are now empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers. And so it goes on to say that you shouldn't say anything to them. Don't talk to them. Don't mention, oh, there's a new guy down the street. Don't have a conversation, because any information that you give them could be used to recapture slaves. So 1851 kind of seems like a long time ago, but you can think about the great-grandmother that told the grandmother that told the mother that told somebody, don't talk to the police. And I think it's only in appreciating that that's the kind of baggage that communities and police officers have as we approach this, can we begin to address this issue. On the justifiable homicide front, I mean, you've got these 300 to 400 a year that take place, and you know, somebody in here maybe could use this to really understand through a registry of these homicides, where they're geographically placed and how that correlates with episodes of violence or asthma attacks that are more frequent. Or when you really think about it, this is 400, but not, because the family and friends and broader the community have been telling these stories all along. I mean, I remember one of my friends telling me about his son calling the police because he heard a strange noise in the house, and he had on his bathrobe and his house slippers, and wound up being arrested. Now, you know, you think about that and you think, okay, he must have done something to the police. I really am charging us now in this day of cameras to have a lot more empathy for that kind of situation. I've heard the stories. Oh, you heard the story of Skip Gates. He got arrested right in his own house in Cambridge. So we know that, but it's kind of this isolated thing here and there. And I'm not saying that all 400 of those represent that kind of story, but somebody needs to get up under there and really understand what percentage it is and what are the demographics of it and where are they located and how does it correlate to all the other public health issues that we are addressing, because, you know, they have, you know, mothers, fathers, daughters, sisters, cousins, family, community, and those are the kind of stories that create a problem when you're trying to build community-police relationships. The other part of this story that we have to take into consideration is the incarceration rates in the United States. And, you know, this kind of drastic difference, you know, makes you say, okay, so Black and Latino men are just committing more crimes. That's the explanation. But again, I think we have to get up under this when we start seeing things like, you know, a child who's 12 years old playing with a gun in a toy gun in the park, and somebody calls the police, and within, you know, 4 or 5 seconds, the child has been killed. There's something wrong there, and there's a dynamic that has to be understood and addressed. And our incarceration rates are off the chart as well compared to other countries, and this is a breakdown by race. Well, I don't think that the police are any more a problem than any other profession, quite honestly. They intersect with this one in a much more consistent and visible way. But all of our professions have a little bit of that junk that we've been talking about. And in this thing of preventing violence, I think it's a collaboration with the police that is particularly important, which is why I show this slide. And, you know, I now know that we use, you know, universal, selected, and targeted, and we've got primary, secondary, tertiary, but it was kids here in Philadelphia who called it up front, in the thick, and after the fact, and I've used that since then, because I think that just really captures what we're talking about. And this chart really kind of illustrates responsibility, and I've used this over the years because it's been very helpful to me when, you know, someone asked me, for example, how do you expect a gang member who shot somebody to benefit from a classroom activity on what makes you angry? Well, you know, a classroom activity on what makes you angry is more upfront, and a gang member who shot somebody is more in the thick. And when you organize people who are working on this issue, like many of you in the audience, it becomes really clear that each of us has a role. And even when you talk about prevention, you can look at the criminal justice side of things and expect that some of their work, really good work, is in this category of prevention. So the collaborations are huge we have to recognize the history, and we've got to help communities address it. It's not easy, but it can be done. What public health has done to help with the knowledge here is around the epidemiologic information that helps us understand risk factors and helps us understand the situation in which these things occur. And there's nothing surprising here at all. My favorite up here is the culture of violence, so we'll come back and I'll talk some more about that. But I don't think any of these others will surprise you. Interestingly, girls, even though there seemed to be an increase in their fighting, as noted by arrest rates and suspension rates, they don't use guns as much. So it's access to guns, but in a cultural context, which is kind of an interesting way to think about it, because in theory, boys and girls have the same access to guns. They get them from homes and neighbors, and witnessing and victimization is one area where a pretty substantial and robust literature is emerging. And actually, neglect is in there as a significant risk factor, maybe even more so in some studies than actual physical abuse, which is interesting. But these risk factors and the resiliency will operate on a few different levels, and I think it's particularly important from a public health perspective as we talk about the ecological models and the influences on adolescents, to appreciate that it's not just the risk but also the resiliency that can be encouraged at each of these levels. And adolescents are particularly vulnerable to the influence of peers, the larger society and community. But if you've got a society that's glamorizing and promoting violence, then it makes it particularly difficult for parents to raise nonviolent children. We do it, we try hard, we are models, and we talk about it, and we, when they get in a fight at school, we try to not ask, so did you beat them up or did you win? But it's difficult, and there are parents who say, you go back outside and you beat him up or I'm gonna beat you. And that's a part of this whole culture and society and belief that violence is going to solve some problems. So it's a challenge that we make when we offer this. One of the things that, and this is sort of another lesson, while we were working with a lot of the children, people were talking about PTSD, and it became very clear that, it's not that children have left the war and are no longer exposed. So the notion of post-traumatic wasn't as appropriate, even though some of the similarities in terms of symptoms and coping mechanisms were there. And so this notion of chronic traumatic stress or complex traumatic stress is important to at least begin to label the experience of a kid who's afraid every day walking home from school or afraid at home. And that's an important distinction that's worth our conversation. So adverse childhood experiences is another sort of newer way of capturing the difficulty that children have when they experience bad things, or the junk, if you will, in society. And this is an effort to try to understand the mechanisms by which the ACEs impact health and well-being. We know things like children exposed to violence. Not sure what that is, but let's see if we can make it go away. And then if we're in 300 minutes, if we need if I'm still up here, we got a problem. But we know, for instance, children with asthma exposed to violence have more frequent hospitalizations. There, again, an emerging literature around health outcomes and the stress of violence and exposure to violence. So this is beginning to accommodate some of that. I think we are not able to go forward. Let me see if this will do it now. Right, so that warning said I'm not going to be able to advance, I guess. Let me see if I can go back. No,
Security updates
it's a security update.
from our IRT team.
Does it take long? I can
There we go.
pivot. Oh, good,
That's fine.
good.
Back to business.
All right. That does deserve a round of applause. Thank you. And thank you for being here. All right. So I don't know how many of you remember the work of Peter Scales and others on the 40 developmental assets. So, I'm not trying to be trite when I say ACEs are the new developmental assets, but I just want us to appreciate that it's kind of another way of looking at the problem, and that way did generate a fairly robust set of programs and practices. Interestingly, and data showing that if you had, there were 40 developmental assets, and if you had 29 of them or more, you were going to be all right. And if you had 12 or 14 to 29 with some help, you could, and then if you had less than the 14 or 12, there were going to be some bad outcomes. And I think there's room for us to really look at the developmental assets from this group and the ACEs and really come up with some powerful ways of understanding, but more importantly, set the stage for responding. We measure and label a lot. It's the what to do about it that is often the most challenging. I also want to mention anticipatory guidance, because it's something that I still think is extremely important as we train pediatricians and this issue of violence, but there is information that parents weren't always happy to have these discussions with physicians. And so learning more about how to have those discussions about punishment, about firearms, about arguing practices is a challenge to the health community, and that getting better at that, because I remember that there were patients who were very annoyed when I had the audacity to talk to them about smoking. I mean, this was, now a cultural difference, but then, I remember riding in the car with my father. I was about, 8, 9, and he had 2 friends in the car. This was a long time ago. And this is illustrative of the cultural difference. So at one point, my father pulls the car over and he says, look, one was smoking cigars and the other was smoking cigarettes. And my father said, look, you're going to have to smoke one at a time here, because when you both smoke, we can't breathe in the car. Yeah. And that was progressive for that day and age, because I'm telling you, smoking was a very glamorous thing to do, and everybody did it. The news report, everybody. So it was a lot of audacity to tell people that they had to smoke one at a time. We've got to get the language and help the cultural changes take place so that we're better at talking about punishment and arguing and those sort of things. I show this a lot. I show it all the time because, one, I'm sort of proud of it, but more than that, because I really didn't do it, but more than that, it's really illustrative of one of the major points I would make, or one of the major lessons learned here, is that we have a problem we do not have to have. We do not have to have this problem. And I think probably the major contribution that public health has made is to say this is preventable, and then to show in places where there's been an impact. So this is the charting of the actual number of homicides of children 16 or younger in Boston. So not all the homicides. But we were going from about one a month in the late 80s, which was one of those peaks we had nationally. Boston also had the peak, all the way down to 0. And we were at 0 for about 4 years. Now, a lot of people in Boston take credit for what happened. Victory does have a lot of handmaidens, and Janet Reno and President Clinton came to Boston to celebrate with the police officers the decline in homicides of children. But what Howard Spivak and I posit is that it was this accumulation of activity that made the difference. Regardless, it's very clear that we don't have to have the problem that we have, and the numbers started ticking back up. One of the most effective programs there was the street outreach workers, the youth workers who were there at midnight, and that's my opinion on that. I can't tease it out. Just like we don't know which program caused us to stop smoking in this country, we just know that we threw the sink at it. And after 30 plus years, we have some impact on behavior. But the reason I say that is at one point we were involved in the training of the street youth outreach workers, and there were at least 120 or so people in the room. And I read later that the city was considering a proposition, the city council, to increase the street workers from 25 to 40. So there had been a substantial reduction that I think might go along with the little bit of uptick that Boston started experiencing. Again, the point is that everybody had something to do with this, that it was no one program, that schools, police, hospitals, people were involved pretty much across the city. John Rich's work on at the hospital on the sucker phenomenon was a part of it. Boston was really active in its efforts. This isn't Boston. Could be, though. Actually, it was one of the places that didn't have as much dueling. But the message here is we can prevent this problem. And dueling is one of the reasons I really believe that, because there was a time when white elite gentlemen dueled. And that was the way that problems of slander, for instance, were solved. And it was a pretty common practice. That is no longer the case. So what happened? We know that, Benjamin Franklin spoke against dueling. Actually, Samuel Clemens did as well. Clergy did. It was a kind of a movement, a dueling prevention movement. I don't know how big it got. We had one doctoral student who started a registry, and he got about 500 duels in there. And all but one were duels of men, and all but one were duels of whites. So it was interesting that to duel, you had to be a gentleman. That was kind of the standard there. But it was such a common practice that guns were made specifically for that practice. It was also illegal. Interestingly, every time you see the state initials here in red, it was the passage of legislation making dueling illegal, or saying you couldn't run for office if you dueled, or it was against the law. Nevertheless, you see down here, the governor in South Carolina actually rewrote the code about dueling. He was the author of, and the code said this is what happens when you slander someone and you don't they ask for an apology, you don't apologize, they send the person the seconds has a conversation with the other seconds, and if back and forth they don't resolve this, then a time and date is set for the duel. It's a little more complicated than that, but that was the process. And this went on. The decline actually started about the Civil War. The peak started, the increase didn't peak after the Revolutionary War, but it started after that. And so there are some theories about why it went away, but nothing of, well, I shouldn't say that. In the legal literature, the issue of the Civil War itself seemed to be where they concluded. But litigation may be substituted for a lot of the response to slander. So I started taking you to court instead of charging you with slander and a duel. At any rate, even though it was illegal, there were places set aside for these duels. This is Bloody Island in the Mississippi. And so that you know, it was really about insults and slander. So this is, the object of this placard is to inform the public that General Lee Reed has declined giving to me an apology for the insult offered me at St. Mark's, and that he's refused me that satisfaction, which as an honorable man he was bound to give. I pronounce him a coward and a scoundrel. And that was the beginning of the process. And, it, as I said, was a pretty common practice. I started thinking about this because of Fox Butterfield's book, All God's Children, where, it's interesting in its own right, but within that, he looks at the dueling in South Carolina and in Louisiana, and estimates rates of 18 per 100,000 and 17.4 per 100,000. So that chart that went up and down like that, 18 is up at the top and a bit beyond. The peaks were around, I think, 12 on that one. But clearly, a problem for a particular population. Harriet Martineau, I love this, said, hey, in 1834, there were more duels than there are days in the year, 15 one Sunday morning. And they're not counting, shooting in a quarrel. These were orchestrated. And some people think that the history of ambulances in this country is doctors with their carriages going to the duels to respond. So I'm not sure about that, but it's an interesting proposition. But it was a common practice, and I can't wait to see Hamilton. He's coming to LA in August, and I got my tickets. Has it come here yet? No. I'll tell you a secret. The way I got my tickets was buying season tickets at the theater as soon as they announced it's a part of the season. And that was cheaper than one Hamilton ticket online, and this was 2 years before it was going to get there. So I just letting you know. But Alexander Hamilton had a son who was killed in a duel in 1801. And in 1804, Aaron Burr challenged him to a duel. And I think it was that he had insinuated that Aaron Burr had told a lie and wouldn't apologize. Just think about that. Yeah, in our current political context. Whoa. Okay, so the night before, he wrote in his journal why he shouldn't duel, and that included that he had a wife and children and loved them, that he was in debt, he didn't want to leave them that debt, that there really wasn't that much bad between him and Aaron Burr, that it was illegal. So, Alexander Hamilton is a lawmaker, right? And that it was condemned by Christianity, which was his religion. And then he wrote why he needed to duel, and one was a pressing necessity not to decline the call. So that's called peer pressure. We recognize that pretty clearly. That it would cost him political support, so that's my posse's not gonna hang with me if I don't show that I'll fight. And essential to his ability to be useful in the future. And so that's the very utilitarian notion of it, like they're gonna take my lunch money every day if I don't beat them up. So in spite of having a son who was killed in a duel and having some pretty good reasons not to duel, Alexander Hamilton woke up the next morning and took a boat to Weehawken, New Jersey, and was killed in a duel. If Alexander Hamilton couldn't resist the cultural context that caused him to duel, we really have to be surprised in some ways that not more of our kids, especially those feeling and experiencing the junk in this society, don't resort to violence. We've got a problem we don't have to have, but thank God they're not as big a problem. It's not as big a problem as you might imagine if there weren't some mechanisms within families and within communities to deal with this junk. And this is probably the biggest lesson that I learned in the classroom teaching violence prevention, and that was that if you can create a context where the young people will share with you how they avoid fights, then you've got a gold mine. Because you're getting authentic, practical responses that are situational. And I think we just have to appreciate that a lot of the mamas and daddies out there know what we need to know and what we need to take to scale. A lot of the young people know. A lot of the churches know. We just have to listen with a different ear, In public health, we can get a little self-righteous sometimes, and we know a lot. But in this case, we really need to listen to people who are in the junk, in the thick, and somehow avoiding the violence, or at least beginning to deal with it in some pretty healthy ways. So I want to make sure, have we exhausted the time for questions, or do we have? Okay, I want to make sure that we have time for comments and questions. I do want to highlight among the things that we have learned, the Unity Project helped us understand that cities could, in fact, have an impact on this problem, especially if you could start at the mayor's office and get all the right people around the table. And there are just several examples of that. Los Angeles just celebrated the 25th anniversary of the Violence Prevention Coalition there, and their successes include quite a bit of measurable reduction. Again, it's very hard to say this caused that. And again, for me, the reduction in smoking in the United States is a great example. I have another story about smoking. I remember I was in 3rd grade, and a nurse came in and brought the lungs of a person who smoked and the lungs of a person who didn't smoke. And oh my God, I mean, that may be why I became a doctor. I have no idea, but I remember being so struck at the difference of just shrunken and charred versus, all fluffed out. Now, both of the people were dead, so that was, it didn't dawn on us in third grade, but that was part of the problem. But it matters what we do, and figuring out how to do it collectively and at scale is probably the challenge in front of us. I like Minneapolis' story because their approach was to develop mentors for a big brother, big sister, and other one-on-one activities for all the children in, I think it was 2 neighborhoods that had the worst statistics. And I don't know if you know the data about big brother, big sister generally, but it's certainly suggests that would be part of the impact that you see here. Of course, truly, you've got to do time series, you've got to do the up and down, how much of the down is really a down or just part of the down. We appreciate that. You know that. However, it does suggest, as I said, that we can do something about this. And I think if that's the only message that we give, that's an important one. So I had an aha moment some years ago that I will share with you because it helped my public health self-righteousness. I had a friend who called me and said she wanted me to meet this man who had a program called Boxing Out the Violence. And I said, I am not meeting a man with a program called Boxing Out the Violence. Boxing is the problem, not, the solution. And, because she was a friend, and I think she even knew my mother or something. Somehow, I agreed to meet this man, and I actually set it up in the conference room with 2 staff people, and I literally was gonna walk in there, say hello, walk out, and let them figure out how to get out of there. And in walks this 75-year-old, very charismatic, retired boxer who was just as energetic and amazing. Literally, one staff person joined his board and started helping him raise money for the program. He basically said, look, I can go to any corner in Boston, any street corner, and start talking to any kid there, Roxbury, South Boston, black, white, doesn't matter. And I can get the kid into the gym, and I can teach him violence prevention. And they were very impressed with the program when they went to visit. I didn't go visit, but I was impressed with him in the conversation. And as I said, one of them joined the board. It was very humbling for me to really think about this encounter, though, because if he had said, I have a program with martial arts and violence prevention, I would have responded very differently. So, Miss Violence Prevention, working on it for 20 years, got it down pat, really missed this one. I was humbled by realizing I didn't even want to talk to him. So if I were a funder, I would not have read that proposal. This problem requires of us a different ear a real appreciation of the strategies that people are currently using that are preventing violence. We can help, we the professional community. We can help with our data, we can help create a platform for them to speak. A lot of the work that I did with survivors of violence, parents whose children had been murdered, represented trying very hard to create a platform for their leadership, for their understanding. And I learned so much about sibling survivors. I learned so much about forgiveness. Very interesting part of the knowledge that we in public health are missing. We have pieces of it that are missing. And I really think that the take-home message is we have a problem that we don't have to have. We know some of the things that we need to do, we just need to take them to scale. And one of the things that we need to do is to listen carefully and promote those who are actively preventing violence currently and understand the strategies. And when we get an invitation from the city council or the state legislature, that's who we need to take with us. So we have to learn enough about who they are and have them lead us. And that includes young people as well. In fact, I would say it especially includes young people. So I think we can have a conversation now. You can tell me what you think and ask me some questions, and I can tell you more about what I think. But fundamentally, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Oh, where? Oh, okay. I was like, where are you?
Drexel School of Public Health in Lum. I graduated in 2008, and I'm from Massachusetts.
Ah, great.
I grew up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and I remember when I was 13 years old, I'm a first-generation Cape Verdean American. And I remember when I was 13 years old, I lived in the South End of New Bedford, and we had this like dueling kind of, oh, I'm from the South End, and I had friends from the West End of New Bedford. And so you weren't supposed to kind of associate with, with other people from other parts of town. But
Can you hear her back? Yes, okay, good.
So an incident happened when I was 13, this is in the early 90s, where someone got shot from a stray bullet from rival gangs in New Bedford. And that person was a friend of mine who was 14 years old, who was into basketball, and it happened at the basketball court, where there were other young kids, 12, 13, playing basketball. And I remember when that happened, and I just know that for me and for the community of Cape Verdeans where I lived, it was very, very impactful, because even if you were from the South End or West End, wherever you were from, when that moment, when our friend died, and we all went to like the same church, so that's what brought us together on Sundays, no matter what part of New Bedford you were from, church brought us together. And I remember when that happened, the person who passed away was 14 and he was really into basketball. So our high school, I went to New Bedford High School, and at the time I was actually in middle school, but getting ready to go into freshman year of high school. And so the basketball coaches in middle school and in high school made it a point to enrich the basketball program, because the person who was shot loved basketball. And so if it wasn't for sports, for me anyway, I became a basketball player in middle school and in high school. And I wouldn't be where I am. I wouldn't have went to UMass. I wouldn't have came to Drexel without my coaches and my parents, of course.
Yes.
Strict parents.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
It hit my heart, because I just remember, I have many friends who have perished through gun violence, through suicides because they couldn't take. I had one friend who actually accidentally killed someone.
Yeah.
And then their family retaliated and killed them a week later in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And so violence, I think, is everywhere. And
Yeah.
for me, I worked in after I graduated from UMass, I worked at a school in Mission Hill in Roxbury.
Ah.
And it was an after-school boys and girls science club. And the stories they would tell me about living in Roxbury, and this was like in, I want to say, 2005, 2004, are the same stories that I hear from youth that I have worked with in North Philadelphia.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter where we are, it just, violence is.
I thank you for sharing. I think you probably have even more that could inform a project and activity based on those experiences. You know, it's a problem we don't have to have, whether we're talking the guns or the, and it's, you might remember the name Tiffany Moore. She was 11 years old sitting on the mailbox in Boston. That was about 84 and was killed in a similar way with the, and the community began to rally around that. I think we've numbed a bit to it. I think we have, accepted that some situations are just like that. I mean, earlier today, I was talking to students and I shared that, my experience in the emergency room that I shared where the young man said, don't go to bed, because it wasn't the first time that happened. That happens a lot in emergency rooms where people have been injured violently. They talk about revenge. But there was something about my experiences, and I think specifically that I knew too many nonviolent black men, from my father to my husband to my friends, to accept that this was an inevitable thing that just was going to happen. So it bothered me in a way that it might not have bothered others, or others might have been bothered but not compelled to do something about it, feeling that it was kind of the way it is. And I think we have to challenge ourselves when we're in those situations to appreciate that, the Jonathan Mann quote at the beginning, if we don't try, will it change? And we pretty much know the answer to that. So I really appreciate your sharing. And, I don't know where you're planning to do your work and concentrate, but I suspect you have something to share to the literature there. Yeah. I see a hand in the back. Yeah.
Around you, you felt like you were kind of boxed into a situation. I enjoy hearing about the talk program and the CAP program. But I was wondering, did you talk to kids about their culture and that whole understanding of, when you're boxed in and you feel like everyone's around you, how would you respond to that situation? Because I feel like that's a big deal. Especially for someone who's like 8th grade or 12 years old or anything like that. Because I've experienced that, and I know that if a bunch of people around you, you got to know where to go. You got to throw it back there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I was curious about what you think about that and how you feel like they address that.
It is not easy, and one of the things that happens in school is the change in the school climate. So that, and I sort of talked about being in the classroom and making people feel comfortable. Wrong with you, you're supposed to be tough. So it does, what others expect you to do has a lot of impact on what you do, especially during those adolescent years. I think there are a couple of responses. One is, and I know one of the projects here in Philly is related to the Harlem Children's Zone, but Jeff Canada wrote a book called Fist, Stick, Knife, and Guns. And it is the story of his growing up and literally being taught to fight and advancing to the point where he was told it's okay, you can now fight with a stick, it's okay that, you know, now the knife and then the gun, but that there was a whole process that the older boys taught the younger boys in the neighborhood about how to fight. So if that can be taught, then the answer to your question can also be taught once we understand how to get out of that situation. One kid, when we were sharing, talked about using humor. And, you know, he had perfected the art of being funny. And so, you know, he said, it's not always funny, but, you know, it gets me out of difficult situations a lot of time. And there's some I messages, and you know, there's some strategies, but you know, figuring out how those who are in those situations are currently doing it is part of my response. The other is right here. Dr. John Rich did quite a bit of work on what he called the sucker phenomenon, and you know, I don't know, John, if you have some comments about that, but.
Well, I think that, you know, young people who feel like the environment is hostile sometimes have to show people that they don't tolerate victimization, particularly when the police you don't believe the police will protect you.
Right.
So, I'm sorry. Particularly if you don't believe the police will protect you, then sometimes what we heard young people say in interviews was that you have to show the world that you're not going to be a victim. And even if you're highly traumatized, that may even make it worse. So exactly what you're saying, that many young people are forced by the environments that they live in to fight. And we often try and, when we're working with young people, to ask them to look to responsible adults in their environment to protect them if they're there. And so I think part of our job is to rebuild the structures around young people so that they don't feel like particularly children don't feel like they have to themselves. But I hear exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's about changing some of the norms about what we do, but also changing the environment in which young people live.
So if you are ever in the classroom or in a situation where you're talking to young people, asking that question is I think, a way of learning some of what is effective for them. But that's an important. The culture piece is. I remember one teacher at a high school in Boston who was doing the violence prevention curriculum calling me and saying, I'm really upset because this kid used some of the strategies and actually avoided a fight, but his parents didn't think he should have done that. And they were really upset with him and upset with her as a teacher because he had avoided a fight. So, you know, you can't set the individual up without appreciating. I mean, you can a little bit, as long as you're honest with them and you say, this is the culture and this is likely to be the response. But it requires a climate change, a cultural change, a real attitude change, and that's difficult. But a lot of parents stopped smoking when their kids came home and started talking about how smoking was bad. So I'm thinking that, you know, maybe we can set a few of the kids up to help us with that. Yes.
ground level. And it's a little frustrating for me because I just finished a panel of patients and also over here from St. Christopher's Hospital in North Philadelphia. And we know that murder is no accident. We see the trajectories, unfortunately, in the families that we serve. Yet there's not the structure that Dr. Rich was talking about here in Philadelphia to really be able to kind of prevent some of the early childhood trauma, the ACEs, all that. And even when they get to a point where there's a parent who's incarcerated, like we were talking about, we used to have a program here for adult services for kids with incarcerated parents, and there's nothing. We used to have something called Adolescent Violence Reduction Partnership to work with younger kids, so that when I saw a 10-year-old who was in 4th or 5th grade, who was at high risk, truancy, maternal mental health, all those things that we know put a kid at high risk of violence, there's not that yet here in Philadelphia. So I guess my question to you is, if there was, if you could rub a magic
Yes.
you chose like 3 interventions besides reasonable gun laws and stuff like that. And I can tell you mine, and maybe you can tell me if I'm way off. But we see a lot of like chaos. We talk about your neighborhood and a lot of neighborhoods. There's so much concentrated area of poverty in Philadelphia and Chicago and Detroit that people who had the capacity to get out got out, and then it leaves this kind of simmering neighborhood where you have to fight, where you don't have, you have a mother who's doing so much chaos and mental health issues and chaos, and it's really tough to kind of be there doing it on her own. That my strategy would be focusing on, one, mother, mental health and self-care. 2 would be, focusing on very early childhood developmental issues, kind of less than 5 years of age, investing in those kids before they get even into kindergarten. And then having people on the ground, like teachers and doctors, who really see these families who have the risk factors. They have a book, like Rich wrote about, Mariana, that we have a place to kind of refer families to, or at least have an investment within our own healthcare system so that they don't have to go to someone else. That's my kind of thing.
So mine are a little different, but I really appreciate yours. I would say that one of the reasons I like the 40 developmental assets is that it puts the onus on us to create that asset if we're trying to respond. And the adverse childhood experiences could cause us to do more labeling and not responding. So that's really one of the concerns I have, and the reason I sort of juxtapose those two to say, there is a literature that says if you give kids these 29 things, they're likely going to be okay. So that said, I would focus in the thick as a set of strategies. I think the primary prevention strategies are important, and I also think what we do when there is violence is also important. But for the limitation you've given me, I would stick to in the thick. And one place where we are similar is with the parents. I would definitely work with the families of these kids because I appreciated in my clinical practice that no matter what I came up with, I could not ever come close to what an enfranchised and resourceful family could do for a kid. And I thought that was right on. I would also do the big brother, big sister. And I would do that to scale. So if I had that kind of one and I could give everybody in there a big brother, big sister, especially one from the Dornsife School of Public Health, I would definitely, yeah, that was a bit of a hint, but. I would do that, one, because of the data, and two, because it just makes sense. As a parent, I know that it is very helpful to have the godmothers, godfathers, aunties, and uncles who, you know, are also in charge of my children. Well, they're adults now, but in charge of my grandchildren. It's just extremely helpful as a community. And then I would probably find a way to pay a critical mass of a version of street youth outreach workers. People who are from that community, who are either successful in having graduated high school, or, you know, stayed out of jail, or didn't go back to jail, and really figure out a way to give them a job, a title, and some pay for helping you respond to the families when those kids come out. So separate from the mentor. So I guess one of the times that I heard Alvin Poussant speak, he's the psychiatrist that wrote Why Blacks Kill Blacks and Raising Black Children with James Coma. But when I heard him speak, he said, you know, if we really want to break this cycle, we need to take all the 8-year-olds and remove them and socialize them differently and then bring them back. So that was pretty dramatic. But what it caused me to think is that if I could, I would identify probably the 6-year-olds in the Philadelphia public schools. There's a finite number of them. In Boston, because Boston's pretty small, the number was something like 35,000. So it's even a manageable number in a lot of ways. And actually make sure that they have the 29 assets. And in 10 years, when they are 16, or if you start with 18, I think we would be able to try to break that cycle. But it's here in Philadelphia, the Me Institute, MEE, by Ivan Jazang, did a survey of the adolescents, and they said that the adults ignore them and are hostile to them, and that's one of the things that you talk about, find a responsible adult. Well, if the adults are acting like they don't want to be bothered with you, it makes it very difficult to find a responsible adult in the community. You know, so that's how I would approach it. Not too dissimilar from your thinking, but really, how do we get the adults around those children enfranchised and resourced in a way that can really help to break the cycle?
I think we're going to have to wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.